Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. If you can't have Kreskin, you'd better get Kornacki. Some of you are too young to remember the amazing Kreskin with Johnny Carson, but I can, and Steve Kornacki could do that bit right now. I'm going to ask him to put an envelope up next to his head and tell me what's polling on impeachment going to be like in 3 months, Steve Kornacki.
I remember Kreskin, too. I think one thing is clear on polling right now. The inquiry, there's consistent support for it, separate from the question of impeachment and removal. I wouldn't be surprised if a few months from now it looks about like it does right now. That seems to be the pattern. That seems to be the safe bet in politics these days. Things seem to polarize and just sort of set in place. The numbers have moved a little bit in the last 2 weeks. Democrats have come much more firmly in favor of it. There's been a little bit of cracks among Republicans, independents, but I think the safe bet usually in politics is that things these days is that they'll stay the same.
Okay, I've made one big bet this week, which could be wrong, which is that the Turks will stop and we will not have a humanitarian nightmare in Kurdistan portion of Syria. Here's my second big bet. As Americans become aware of what Cipollone argued in his letter to the White House counsel yesterday, and I argued in a Washington Post column today, the tide is going to turn decisively against this because not the underlying facts, that's a debatable jump ball, but process matters to Americans, and there were rules laid down in 74 and 98, House resolutions governing both the impeachments of Nixon and Clinton, that the Pelosi Schiff impeachment has thrown out the window. It smacks of a rigged game, and I compared it to the 1972 Men's Olympics final in basketball, Steve. When the game is rigged, Americans don't like it.
Yeah, well, let's see. I could certainly see the argument you're making working in the court of public opinion on Capitol Hill, in particular, keeping Republicans in line, on Trump's side. In terms of the polling on this, like I was saying a minute ago, even before all of this began, right, for the last 2 years, when you polled the question of impeachment, support for it was generally mid-30s, high 30s. Sometimes it would break over into the low 40s. Now you're seeing it into the mid-40s, really. That's pretty consistently. And what's happened there, a big part of what's happened there is a number of Democrats, I think, were hesitant, and I think they were picking up on the hesitancy of their own party. Nancy Pelosi, until 3 weeks ago, wouldn't talk about this. Most Democratic leaders until a few weeks ago wouldn't talk about this. And I think what you had happen is basically the entire Democratic Party in Washington has thrown itself behind this, and Democratic voters around the country are kind of taking their cue from that. And now when you poll it, you're seeing a dramatic jump in the number of Democrats behind this. I suspect that dynamic is here to stay as long as this impeachment drama plays out.
I believe the Democrats won't leave until they see a political cost. And I think the political cost depends entirely on a unified message delivery system from the president down to the local party chairman, which is it's a rigged game. And that's what I'm looking a month out from now. They began to get that message out with the Cipollone letter yesterday, and they have the evidence on their side, the facts on their side when they used 1974 and 1998's resolutions to show that the Democrats are not allowing the minority counsel to call witnesses, cross-examine witnesses, it's secret hearings. It's all very not American. And I think that's a winning message we will see in 2 weeks. Let me talk to you about the Democratic primary. I'm fascinated. What do you see happening to Joe? I never heard of Hunter Biden, the Ukraine, until this whistleblower stepped up. Never had heard of it. And I think a lot of people's eyes are wide and getting wider about this. It's got to be hurting Joe Biden, isn't it?
Well, so look at it this way. If you take the average of all the national polls, they just kind of keep a Real Clear Politics does a good one of these. A bunch of other sites do as well. Every poll constantly coming out, you throw it into the national average. Joe Biden's been in this race for 6 months now, basically, and he led the national polling average every single day until 2 days ago. And then all of a sudden, Elizabeth Warren passed him for the first. I say passed him. She moved 0.2 of a point ahead of him in the national polling average. And then yesterday afternoon, a new poll came out. He was in second place, but he was a stronger second place, and it actually bumped him back into the lead by a fraction of a point nationally. So that's what you've got going on nationally. Very tight, essentially a tie between Biden and Warren. Certainly, there's two ways of looking at this, I think. Has his support crashed among Democrats or dropped among Democrats since this Ukraine story broke? There's no sign of that. The question I have, though, is this something that will let me put it this way. Let me back up. The aim of his campaign, I think, or the hope of his campaign, was that they would rally Democrats to them based on Trump singling Biden out, Biden becoming a main Trump target, and then Biden being able to rally Democrats and say, see, this guy is scared of me. So there hasn't been a rally to Biden effect that you've seen in the polls. There haven't been any defections from him. So it's tough for me to measure. I do think there's a possibility here as this plays out. It's not that Democrats defect from him in droves and turn on him. It's just maybe perhaps one more subtle reason in their minds to look at the other options in front of them.
Do you go to many movies, Kornacki?
I used to.
Okay, well, there's a great preview now about Ferrari versus Ford, and Ferrari always won Le Mans until they didn't. And this is the story about when the upset happened. Joe Biden was always going to be the front runner until he wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
And when that happens, is there in your experience, and I always tell people that Steve Kornacki is just straight down the middle. It's whatever the data says. What happens when a front runner, I've seen them resurrect before. John McCain in 2008, Elizabeth Warren has resurrected what I called a zombie campaign.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens when a front runner falters? When Muskie cries in New Hampshire, when Gary Hart doesn't have the beef in Iowa, what happens?
It can melt away fast, and that's what I think a lot of people, and certainly one thing I'm looking for with Biden here, if there's a sign that begins to happen. He started out this race, I was saying the national polling average. When he got in, he was at 41% nationally in the average. Now that number's about 26%. It's been stable around 26% really for about a month right now. So he lost a chunk of support over the first few months of his campaign. It seems to have leveled off right now at about 26. But, hey, there's a debate coming up next week. We've seen him struggle in debates. We've seen other candidates stand out at debates, sometimes at Biden's expense. And I do think, and it's something I've been looking for, do you look up in Iowa and suddenly he's not just in second place, but he's in third place? He's falling double digits behind. We haven't seen something like that yet. But I think if we do, and we've seen that in the past, if we do, that's when the door opens to another candidate. That's when the door opens to somebody we haven't talked about so far, whether that is a Booker or a Klobuchar or a Buttigieg, somebody like that. If Biden takes another step back, I think that's when the door is open to some real chaos in this race.
Now, you just did not mention Bernie. And I bring this up very, very grateful that the senator appears to be fine and recovering. But a heart attack is a heart attack is a heart attack. And I believe a lot of Bernie supporters are not going to say this out loud, but I think they've already left the room. What do you see in the polling?
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned the average. Bernie Sanders' average on the day Joe Biden got into this race was 14.6%. That was his average in the polls nationally 6 months ago, and his average in the polls now 14.6%. He has stayed flat the entire time. So it seems that for the first 6 months or so, there's been a pretty a core Bernie base has been established, and that's about the size of it. He has not been able to grow it. It's not the same size nearly as what he was able to put together in 2016 running against Hillary Clinton. And I think, when I say there's you talk about the things that will keep voters from joining a bandwagon they're not already on. I think doubts about health. I think, the oldest candidate in the field, 79 years old, would be the oldest president ever inaugurated, having a heart attack, then talking about, potentially slowing down his campaign, then trying to take that back. I think it does potentially create some barriers. He was already facing some issues just in terms of not being able to build his support, maybe being eclipsed by Elizabeth Warren. I think you add this into the mix. It's like you said. I think everybody with a heart is grateful he's okay. But politically, that's a tough situation.
Let me go back and conclude by talking about Elizabeth Warren and Hillary Clinton. I was on with the Reverend Al and Michelle Goldberg on Sunday. I love doing Al's show because he gives people enough time to talk and make a point, and we get along fine, that we don't agree on anything ever. And I brought up the point that Secretary Clinton, third time, could be a charm. Elizabeth Warren is Secretary Clinton without the grace, good humor, and experience. And Michelle Goldberg just about had a Bernie Sanders-like heart attack. She was so upset with the idea that Hillary Clinton could get in. Is there any polling that shows that's a realistic possibility that she could get in and win?
I have not seen it. I have not seen her polled lately, but I can tell you that unlike some other past nominees, the polling that was conducted in the wake of the 2016 election showed Hillary Clinton's favorable, unfavorable number crashing. And that included a number of Democrats, Democratic-leaning independents. It seemed that as the Democratic nominee in 2016, she benefited from a lot of kind of party loyalty. You know, if you didn't like Donald Trump, rally around Hillary Clinton. The minute it was over and the minute she lost, her numbers, and the number 30 sticks out in my head. I'd have to double check that because I have not seen it in a while. But something like a favorable score of about 30%. Very, very bad numbers, and not even good numbers among Democrats in the wake of 2016. So, you know, I think you can do a lot on whether in her mind she'd like to run again or in her heart she'd like to run again. But I think the numbers that I've seen certainly indicate Democrats have moved on.
And very in the same vein, in that same program, I said Elizabeth Warren is tailor-made to lose Pennsylvania. I grew up 7 miles from Sharon. I know Western Pennsylvania well. Selena Zito agrees with me. I think Elizabeth Warren is just like forfeiting Pennsylvania. Am I wrong?
Well, you know, I always tell people we live in the era when Donald Trump got elected president, so our assumptions about the rules of politics, I think, are all up for debate. And I think there's a strong case that by the traditional rules, our traditional kind of understanding of politics and how they work kind of in the age we live in, our traditional understanding would be, yeah, Elizabeth Warren raises some very clear and obvious electability issues for Democrats. But I do think
in Pennsylvania, I'm talking specifically coal land, right?
Yes, in the position on fracking, and however, as I say, in the era of Trump, there does seem to be a premium on some of the attributes that she brings. You know, she brings this sort of fighting style. You know, Democrats see her as somebody who's she's got a lot of energy. They feel so. It's a question of does she tap into almost that feeling, that yearning for authenticity? It's so hard to define, but does she somehow tap into that in a way that overrides what you would traditionally say are concerns about, you know, policy stands?
Steve Kornacki, always a pleasure. Follow him at Steve Kornacki on Twitter and every day on NBC and MSNBC. Always the guy with the best analysis of the numbers. Thank you, Steve.